From the Sonnets to Orpheus, Sonnet 213. Be ahead of all parting, as though it already were behind you, like the winter that has just gone by. For among these winters, there is one so endlessly winter that only by wintering through it will your heart survive. Be forever dead in Eurydice, more gladly arise into the seamless life proclaimed in your song. Here, in the realm of decline, among momentary days, be the crystal cup that shattered even as it rang. Rainer Maria Rilke, in these two stanzas that open this sonnet, gives us a message. And I've highlighted the salient parts of that message for today in yellow. Be ahead of all parting. That's really what we want to do and must do in order to increase our likelihood of dying in peace. Because if we wait till we've blasted through the double doors of some institution on a gurney, we're already in what I call the crucible, and it's a little too late to be ahead of the game. And be the crystal cup that shattered even as it rang. And Rilke didn't write, be the crystal cup that rang even as it shattered, right? He wrote, be the crystal cup that shattered even as it rang. We will all shatter. What's the tone we're going to go out with? What will the nature of our end days be? Well, all of us say that we want to die in peace. And most of us, that means at home, to which I add with the dog licking my fingers. That's what we want. We don't want to die here. And we're afraid of dying like this. And what we have in mind is a place like this. 90% of us say that we want to die in peace. And only about 15% of us make it. And I mean make it in both senses of the word. That is, get there and cause it to be. Each of my parents died at the end of a 3-week terminal hospitalization. Very briefly, in 2004, my mother, Ruth Greenberg, had sudden respiratory collapse, wound up intubated in the ICU, lickety-split, and it took us about 3 weeks as a family to pull the plug on her and let her go. She was unavailable to any of us during that time. 15 months later, in 2005, my dad, then 84, self-admitted to a JCO 100 facility in Florida for pacemaker eligibility testing. He crashed medically under that testing, acquired nosocomial urinary tract MRSA, which migrated to his bloodstream, and that demise also unfolded over about a 3-week period, which is the average if you know about medical anthropology. The upshot of these experiences, which were, I could just characterize at the moment as wrong hospitalizations from start to finish in ways large and small, day in and day out, was that I began an investigation because I wanted to answer a very simple question from a practical standpoint, because our patient family failed twice in a row, despite that my parents were advanced planned, that we had open dining room conversations. We were a small, cohesive family, and it didn't work. So ultimately, I wrote this book, Notes from the Waiting Room, and have continued thinking probably far too much about end-of-life matters since then. So today, I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of the major points that I've either learned or experienced or uncovered, and before we go on to possible solutions, what might we do about it and why? So I'm going to raise some red flags, and those flags are about impediments. What gets in our way? If we set a course to die peacefully, it actually becomes an obstacle course, both systemically and because of reasons within ourselves, our own hearts, and choices that we make or don't make. And I can't give you all the red flags today, just several of them. So, 4 big hits. To die in peace, we want to recognize the boundary between living with what ails us and dying from what ails us, because that's an essential choice point that we want to make in advance of all parting, right? Secondly, to realize that death is timed in hospitals. And I didn't make this up. Again, this is medical anthropology. Sharon Kaufman out in San Francisco did a 2-year study, and that's how it played out over hundreds of demises. There was an average time, and there were reasons for it. Clinical reasons, social reasons, insurance reasons, and patient family reasons. Understanding and reframing engagement in heroic activity is a huge piece of making a choice whether we end up terminally hospitalized or maybe not. And pondering a few things about who owns our dying. Is it us or is it somebody else or something else? So I had an interesting experience. Writing a book takes a long time, a couple of years at least. And I was about 1.5 years into it. The first 2/3 of the book I was done about how to advocate when hospitalized. And literally I pushed back from my keyboard with great satisfaction, a big sigh of, wow, that one's off my plate, now I can do the last third. And all of a sudden a thought flitted down. It was quite amazing, and it was this: the best way to manage a terminal hospitalization is not to have one. I'd just written 200 pages about managing one, and this thought occurred to me, and then lickety-split, another thought occurred to me. Well, if death is timed in hospitals, and I don't want to die there, then I guess I have to time my own death. This is like primer level thinking, right? It's just what happened. And what on earth does that mean? It's an incredibly simple thought with very, very profound ramifications, very challenging to answer. Well, here are some of the key issues around this. We tend to over-resolve and under-execute. And that's one potential problem with advanced directives. And psychology is studying this, which is why I chose this dance floor graphic. We might, at our age now, resolve that we do or don't want one thing or another, and we might revisit those directives in 5, 10, or 15 years. But when the crunch comes, when we find ourselves in the crucible, if your mom is all of a sudden intubated in an ICU, are you going to pull the plug right away, or are you going to let her linger for 3 weeks while we pursue a course of treatment and try to figure it out, despite what the advanced directive said? That shows up in this interesting graphic from a doctor in Boulder. When there's a high chance of recovery associated with low risk, of course you pursue the treatment and recovery. And as the chances of recovery get less, the risk gets higher. These things overlap, and you get into this black zone at the bottom where you can have bad outcomes despite good intentions. And that's where that dance floor, that irresolution comes in, and you end up going down the slippery slope. And the slippery slope is where we say we don't want to be. And I think the nub of it is all about resuscitation matters and applied life support technology. And those happen in 2 distinct realms that we could talk about for a long time, each of them. First responder requirements and the way they play out on the street, and why some of our directives may not work there, and of course what happens in the ICU and ED. But here's the crux of it, and this stuff is not talked about. Life support is a continuum with reflexive transitions between these 3 uses to which the same equipment is put. The first we take for granted. It is saving a life. That's what it's named for. But the other 2, the same equipment is used in the OR for surgery, and it's also used as treatment whenever providers say it is and whenever we agree. And that is the slippery slope, and it's so easy to move from one phase to the next. But wait, shouldn't advanced directives save us? And I'm a proponent of them. We must execute advanced directives, and by the way, a living will is only one of 8 or 9 that together comprise a suite of legal documents. But the problem is that they can be to dying in peace as the starry skies were to the Titanic. They are not a guarantor of dying in peace, no matter what. And I have been a passenger on this boat twice. I have crewed it once, and if I am fortunate in my resolve, I will not captain it. I don't want to go on that boat a 3rd time. So, with that said, what can we do proactively that might raise the likelihood of our dying in peace? The second half of Sonnet 213. Be, and yet know the great void where all things begin, the infinite source of your own most intense vibration, so that this once you may give it your perfect assent. To all that is used up and to all the muffled and dumb creatures in the world's full reserve, the unsayable sums. Joyfully add yourself and cancel the count. Give it our most perfect assent. That's our goal. In an ideal world, ideal outcomes, that's what we want to happen. And we will add ourselves and cancel the count in one way, shape, or form. So some years ago, a palliative physician named Joanne Lynn, she's pretty well known in the palliative world, she created a series of what we call trajectories, mapping the three major disease causes of death and how they will be experienced. So this shows that if you have cancer, you're basically vital for a long period of time, and then you have a quick decline. If you have heart or organ failure, the downward spikes are incidents of, let's say, a heart attack number 1 and heart attack number 2 12 years later, as was my dad's case. And number 3, the long, slow cognitive decline. And this spring, it occurred to me that there's a huge missing piece in this. And recently, I saw it on one of the Facebook lists it was linked to. There was an updated series of charts. How do we die in 1900, and how do we die in 2012? And it was a stack of each of them, and it showed how fewer causes of death there were. But the interesting thing was that it was only disease. When, as most of us here know, one of the primary causes of death in America includes medical error. And if you were interested in dying in peace, and if you knew that death was timed in hospitals, and all of the stuff that's related, and the slippery slope of life support technology, and the whole of it, maybe we'd want to know about medical error. And I guarantee you that this is nothing that medicine will tell us, even palliative and hospice docs. When I emailed this to Joanne, because I emailed her and I said, hey, Joanne, I'm updating your trajectories. And I sent it to her, and she emailed me back and said I can share her response. And she said something that was fascinating. She said, I can see the utility in this. I would not have thought of doing this because medical error is part and parcel of all the other tracks. And the meaning that I make of this is because now when doctors fail to tell us about this, like in the typical panel, most of our exposure in the end-of-life conversation at this point is a 1 to 2 hour panel presentation hosted by a university or a hospice, and the whole cast of characters is usually there except us, right? There's no patient family representative on the panel. And they won't say this because it's the water they swim in. They won't recognize to tell us this, but I think it's a vital aspect of maybe dying in peace. Another huge piece is heroicism. If we have failed to recognize that we've already engaged in heroic activity to save life, to fight for life, or to sanctify life, if you're religiously inclined, then you're probably going to save it all up and do it at the very end, or what becomes the very end. But maybe, just maybe, you've done it over a longer period of time. So let me tell you what these graphics mean. In my dad's case, he lived to 84. A 3-week terminal hospitalization at age 84 is equivalent to the last minute of a 24-hour day. So start your clock right now and know that you will die 23 hours and 59 minutes from now, tomorrow evening. That's your time to get ready and have a terminal experience. Are you going to wait till that last minute to try to figure it out and do your business? All right? Or if you didn't think that you had already done anything, you're going to try to squeeze it all in. But hey, there's a couple of heart attacks there. There's a hip replacement that went bad, and another hip replacement. So I put these white hats there to represent my father's heroic engagement medically. And I hadn't figured this out when it was happening. It took years after it, for sitting around working this out. And I realized that maybe I would have, as his son and potential proxy, maybe I would have engaged him in different conversations about that pacemaker eligibility testing and all that ensued as a result of it. So we can wait till the bitter end or not. But this is another huge piece. Have we been heroic? And here's another way to express it. If this entire screen represents an 84-year lifespan, there's a little yellow rectangle in the lower right-hand corner. That's even bigger than the last 3 weeks would be. So imagine we have some choices now. We can wait till the bitter end. We can go 1 year out, 5 years out, 10, 15, 20 years out. The sooner we start parsing all these issues, the greater our likelihood is of maybe achieving a peaceful demise, depending on all the conditions. Well, if we don't, this is what happens, and there's lots of this stuff happening. Train wrecks, train wreck demises. And that is, there is a good reason we use the word train wreck, and that reason becomes evident when you start looking at a group of train wreck photos. And it feels like it when you live through with it, especially when it goes on day after day. All told, I call this off-the-shelf dying. In other words, in a way, death has become a commodity that we buy because we do it mindlessly and we queue up. We queue up and we go to that terminal hospitalization or one that becomes one. In a way, this is an absurd example, but the whole scene gets to be absurd after a while. It's like a box of Cracker Jacks. We all have one. It's all filled with sugary gunk. And the only difference between my box and your box is the trinket inside. And that trinket represents all our particulars, all the variabilities, our disease track, our social standing, our finances, all of it, right? There's a zillion variables, but the constant is, as Sharon Kaufman found, that 3-week terminal hospitalization, which kind of puts the kibosh on dying in peace, by definition. Well, what about palliative and hospice care? They are our best friends, and they are doing active work to come forward in our lives. But I have skepticism for some period of time going forward as to whether they can meet us in time and we can meet them in time. There are a whole batch of systemic impediments, not the least of which is that we don't have to wait for a crash to call for a palliative consult. And it's another point that they fail to mention sometimes in these panels. So, to summarize, be ahead of all parting. The distinction between living with and dying from what ails us. You may make a personal distinction that is different than a medical distinction of what constitutes terminality. Number 2, recognize that death is timed in hospitals so that there are a default track. It's kind of like getting on a moving walkway, and we have a choice as to whether we want to get on that or not. Number 3, Tom Preston, MD, wrote an interesting book, Patient-Directed Dying. And another way to look at this is that by definition, suicide is if you take a viable life. You are healthy. But if you are terminal and you are dying and you want to guarantee that you die peacefully, then the question arises, is doing so suicide? I don't think it is, and I really dislike the phrase physician-assisted suicide, because I don't believe that's what it is, and I think it's a very pejorative phrase. Lastly, my contribution to this, reframing heroic action, and for me it's a huge, huge thing, because if you don't know that you've already been there, then you're going to go there. And it's a very painful place to go. This is new work, and I'm going to present it tonight after dinner, but this is a little preview of it. It occurred to me that we only have one non-euphemistic word for dying, and that is dying. And maybe it would be useful to help us arrive where we want to arrive if we had more than one descriptor for dying. So this is just a quick preview of the unfilled-in matrix that I'll show later. And lastly, we have one life on planet Earth, and we have one death, and we're all going to die in the 21st century. We get to choose the basic contours of that, and in this case, here's a trajectory. It's my dad's trajectory, and the thin yellow line indicates those last 3 weeks of his life. That's the way it played out in our experience. But we can change this if we want. If we begin to attend to these manifest issues well in advance of getting there, then we stand a better chance of actually dying in peace. And dying in peace is required, I think, in order to die at peace.